Hello and welcome to the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast, where we talk about anything and everything fantasy and science fiction. Your host is Matt Crosswhite, and the subject matter expert is Josiah Marshall. And here we go.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Crosswhite, and joined with me is the subject matter expert, Josiah Marshall.
Hello.
And today you've got some other books for us to talk about, yeah?
I've got some books to talk about. I sure do. And I appreciated, so it's what I appreciate about Matt being my host is that he helps keep me structured, on track, and on a certain point. He's my navigator on this journey that we're on. And so
and you'll only believe that because you didn't hear the conversations that we just had before we went live. I think he was reeling me in, but anyway.
Well, so after our last podcast, Matt said, well, how about for our next one, you talk about the top 3 fantasy science fiction books and the top 3 movies. And I thought, you know what? All right, I'll spend some time looking into that. And I had to get myself out of quote unquote expert mode, because in my opinion, I'm not as much of an expert as I might even think at times. But I have read a lot of fantasy. I've read a fair amount of science fiction, and I've seen lots of movies. And finally, I was sitting down and writing the list out, and then I realized, wait a minute. I can either give a list of books that somebody should read, or I can give a list of books that I have read and were probably the most influential, impactful in my life when it comes to these genres. So with that said, this podcast, I'm going to start talking about the top 3 fantasy stories that or novels that I have read that have been the most impactful. How's that sound, Matt?
That sounds excellent. Okay.
Well, the first one I'm going to give is Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. I was introduced to Narnia at a very young age. I did grow up in a very conservative Christian household. And so the options for reading material, especially from a fantasy perspective, was incredibly limited. But nonetheless, Chronicles of Narnia opened up a world of possibilities for me, and it became fast and quickly probably my go-to for many, many, many years. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until a time in my life that got a little more difficult than normal, that the Voyage of the Dawn Treader really took center stage. And the elements of Voyage of the Dawn Treader, if someone's ever read it, please go check it out. It is something, it's more along the lines of what people would dub a child's fantasy story, or even in some cases, maybe a fairy tale. It doesn't have a great deal of world building, or any complexities that you might see in Lord of the Rings. But it is still a story that captures your imagination. You can identify with the characters almost too well, and you can experience the journey with them as well as their growth through the story. So now, for me...
Is it the 3rd or the 4th in the Chronicles of Narnia series?
So the Chronicle series, depending on how you list it. So the Chronicle series, the Narnia series can either be chronologically, by story, or by publication date. So if you start by publication date, then you're going Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Silver Chair, Magician's Nephew. Oh my word. I completely spaced. A Horse and His Boy, and then The Last Battle. I was gonna get there.
Oh, and the Silver Chair.
Well, yeah, I mentioned that one earlier. Yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
that was the publication dates. But if you go through the story chronology, you've got, excuse me, you've got the Magician's Nephew, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Horse and His Boy, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Silver Chair, and Last Battle.
Interesting. I wouldn't have put A Horse and His Boy that early, but it's such an independent story from the rest of what's going on in Narnia. It's almost hard to pin down.
Yeah, it is. But the key points you have is that Shasta, the main character, ends up in Tashbaan, and he gets mistaken for another kid that looks a lot like him. And that other kid was part of the entourage of King Edmund, Queen Susan, and Queen Lucy, who had come down at the request of Tashbaan's prince, Rabadash, and he was basically trying to court Queen Susan. And so that's where you get the timeline fix and all of this.
Gotcha.
But it is not so much a story about Narnia as it is between Calormen and Archenland, which is to the east of the west of Narnia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But you were telling us about how I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, if you're looking at a map, you got Calormen, and then to the north east of that, you've got Narnia, and northwest of that, you've got Archenland.
Gotcha. I didn't mean to derail with that question, but you were telling us about Voyage of the Dawn Treader and how it doesn't have a whole lot of scene setting. So would that almost imply you don't have to have read the previous books in order to jump into this one?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Now, if you do read some of the previous books, then you get character development, specifically in the area of Lucy and Edmund, and also Prince Caspian. Now, if you do read the previous book, then you can begin to understand who these three main characters are, including the mouse Reepicheep, which is Reepicheep is my favorite character in the entire book.
Wow.
Yeah. The talking mouse.
Is he the one you identified with?
No.
Okay.
But he was definitely my favorite. The one I identified with was Eustace. Now, there's an opening line to the book. There's a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. I have since had a more dad joke to that regarding one of my dog's names, but the similarities between me and Eustace are that in the book, Eustace goes through an experience of becoming a dragon, and then he goes through an experience of de-dragoning. And that became very personal for me when, as I said earlier, at a stage in my life when things got darker than norm, harder than norm. And so as a result, this book really stood out to me as being a number one fantasy book that's impacted my life. And I'm very thankful for the book. But if you've never read it, I highly recommend doing that. And there's several ways to read it or enjoy it. You've got audiobook, you've got the book, of course, and then you've also got radio dramas. And there's more than one radio drama, actually. Most people know about the Focus on the Family one, but there's also one that was done by BBC Radio. And it's not as long as the Focus on the Family. So,
okay.
And then, of course, you've got the BBC movie of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And then you've also got, and that was made back over 20 years ago, but there's even a more recent one that was done by Walden Media. And the kid, the guy that they got, what's his name? Paul, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but the actor that they got to play Eustace in the recent one, wow, that kid was spot on. That kid did a great, not to say that the one in BBC didn't, he did a great job too. It's just that took it to a whole new level. But that would be my number one fantasy book. Voyage of the
Excellent.
Dawn Treader, Chronicles of Narnia, and then depending on what chronology you use, you can figure out which book.
Sure, sure. Which leads us
So,
to Josiah's pick number 2.
pick number 2. All right. Now, this may seem a little odd, I guess, but I'm going to read a something that the author of this next book wrote. And this really captures for me even what the book was about and what I ended up taking away from it. She says that I knew as I was writing Tahn, Tahn, that the story could not end until certain choices were made: love or self-guarded preservation, forgiveness or bitter hate. It is my hope that readers will think about such choices in their own lives. I hope they remember Tahn and see past the surface of the next person they meet. I hope they see a potential hero in every lost and wayward child and pray accordingly. Then Tahn and I will have done our jobs.
Excellent.
Tahn, written by L.A. Kelly, L.A. I found, again, shortly after Voyage of the Dawn Treader became pretty big for me. And it is a story about a guy who is an assassin. And he is tasked with killing somebody, and he ends up not doing it. He ends up kidnapping a woman instead. And I think she was actually part of the target. And so as a result, she ends up being this conflicting voice that sees him, observes him, and starts speaking into his life. And I read this book around the same time I met my wife. And so part of the story not only took on significance for me because, a lot like Tahn, I wasn't a creature that felt capable of being loved, much like the dragon out of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But with Tahn, it was even more personal because you have a character who's conflicted over the idea that he has caused pain, he's caused death in so many people's lives as being an assassin. I'm not an assassin. I was never an assassin, but I can understand that from that point of view, there can be the similar heart aspect of going, I've hurt so many people. What do I do with this? How do I live with this? And so that story took on a very deep personal aspect for me, because not only was it where I was at the moment and just trying to deal with a lot of bitterness and unforgiveness in my life up to that point, but also the aspect of the lady coming in as well. Just it mirrored my life in just so many ways. There was actually, it was a toss-up between that book and one other book. And yet this one ended up winning out only because this is the one that I read both of them more than once, but this is the one that I could identify with a little bit more with the main character than I could with the other main character. Not to say that the other book wasn't phenomenal. I'll go ahead and mention it. It was Giver of Roses by Kathleen Morgan. But Tahn really took it to that next level for me. And I really appreciated that book and what it meant to me in my time of life at that time.
I'm really glad to hear that you didn't identify with Tahn because you too kidnapped your wife. I'm glad to hear you identified on a completely different level.
Yeah, no. It was definitely a story that reflected my life in some ways, and it really gave me vocabulary, and it gave me what I appreciated about the story is just as she was pointing out was the questions. I always enjoy being given questions and questions coming up with what I read. If it's not challenging me to think, I might not read the whole book.
Sure.
Not to say that a good brain, an easy brain read isn't bad, but I have read those and they're fine. But there are those books that I just really enjoy jumping into and being asked questions about life, about belief, about death, all sorts of things. And so that book was definitely up there for me. And so far, that book is only available in book form that I know of. I have not seen any Audible on that, although that could have changed and I could have missed it. But as of now, it's only digital and hard copy. So anyone's looking for new read, and that is L.A. Kelly. She's a great writer. She's very organic with how she approaches her characters. She does very well with using language that invites you into the story. And so I highly recommend that book.
Excellent. So number three.
Okay. Now I have mentioned so far. Now, technically, Lewis, as we all know, is a Christian, and L.A. Kelly is actually a believer as well. But now I'm going to dip into what some of our listeners may know as being epic fantasy. Raymond Feist got started, what was that, the late 70s, early 80s, in writing because he was part of a group. And he and his buddies in college came up with this place called Metemia. And he ended up taking some of the story that they had developed with their permission, and he started writing out these novels. And all of them are really pretty good. I've read them more than once in multiple forms. But the one that stood out to me the most was Prince of the Blood. Some can say it's a standalone, but I tend to think that it really provides connection between two parts of series that take place within Feist's world. It is a story about two twin brothers who, even though they're older, I think they're 18 or something like that, they act like kids. They're still young. They're impetuous. They're the sons of Prince Arutha, which is part of he's ruler over one part of the kingdom, and then his brother, his king brother, is off on another part of the land that they rule. And so these boys, well, they're acting like boys. They're not acting like men. And they are eventually invited to a birthday party of an empress of an empire south of them. That the prince and the king are both hoping they can become allies with. And so in an attempt to make that allyship work, they send the twins down with an entourage. And unfortunately, some stuff happens along the way, and both the twins get separated. And each goes on a journey. Each of them goes on a journey of personal growth and development. And they're finally met with the harsh realities of life, and they are forced to make some choices about things that they're either going to continue to think and behave in a certain way, or they're going to take what they've learned and they're going to apply it. And so for me, the entire series is a blast. And so the fact that they include a lot of characters that he's been using up to this point, he includes into the book. And then also he introduces a new character named Nakor, a really short, bald-headed magician that you wouldn't really think is a magician because you'd think he's more of a con man he's a card shark. He'll play cards and he'll cheat and all this jazz. So, but there was I found the story to be very well balanced. It had great structure. It had a clear point of where it was going. And it just created what may be considered a quintessential environment for people developing more. Some might even call it simple, but really it's sometimes the most quintessential and simple things that can make a story connect with people. It doesn't have to be so gravitas. It doesn't have to be so big and epic. There are epicness of this, but that's because the authors have already done the work in building that into previous stories. And so you've got a lot of history that goes on in the back of your head when you hear a name that they say or something, or a place that they mention. And so that book also came in my life at a stage. Now it actually came in my life before L.A. Kelly. and after Lewis, but before Voyage of the Dawn Treader became such a big part of my life. And so that one came in my life at a point where I was young. I was trying to grow up, so to speak, in the sense that I was trying to fend and take care of myself. And I really attached to that book, and I'm very thankful to have found it. I initially read it in the mass market book form, which for a lot of collectors, which yes, I have collected some fantasy books. The mass market just always has some phenomenal artwork. I've always enjoyed the artwork of some of these fantasy mass market books, but I read it in the novel form, the paperback, and then I also have it on audiobook, which is also a lot of fun. And then it's not that book, but some of the other books that Feist wrote in the series was turned into graphic novels, and so those are some ways you can enjoy Feist. And we'll talk more about him in another episode. But that book, that book really made its mark as my firm number 3. So.
Excellent. That sounds good, and I look forward to picking up copies of your choices 2 and 3, because I'm familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia series, but I've not heard of the others. So I have a feeling that as we do this podcast, my reading list is going to grow exponentially. So, but you did a good job of whetting the appetite and getting me and I would assume the listeners excited about it. So thank you, sir.
Oh, you're very welcome. Glad to do it.
Excellent. So that brings us to the close of this episode. Please join us again next time for Josiah's top 3 picks for sci-fi novel genre. And until next time, happy reading.